And I just want to let everyone know that we are recording this session. So if you're not comfortable being on camera, of course, except for speakers, if you're not comfortable being on camera, then you may want to turn it off. And you can also view this at a later date if you need to go back over something and if you want to share it. So. Okay, all right. So it's been 5 minutes. We've given many people to join, given the chance for many people to join. So we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Media, and I want to thank everyone for taking the time off of their busy schedules to come and join this webinar on the theme of promoting disarmament and non-proliferation, an imperative for international peace and security. And as I mentioned, my name is Media, and together with my partner, Wandi, we are part of the CRIDS team. And today we will be your moderators. And today, of course, we also have a plethora of wonderful speakers who are experts in international security issues and who are well known in the field. But before I go ahead and introduce them, which I'm sure you guys are all waiting for, I'm just going to give you a little bit more background on the topic today so that everyone is a little more aware and it will help to transition into a little more detailed talk. So on October 24 this year, we celebrated the anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, and an entire week was devoted to disarmament to promote awareness and understanding of disarmament issues and their cross-cutting importance. Despite the efforts of the United Nations to promote peace and security, it is important on this day to recall that militarization is accelerating at an alarming rate, with global military expenditures in 2020 estimated to be $1,981 billion, the highest it's been since 1988. The first year for which CIPRI has a consistent estimate of total global military expenditure, and it's also a pandemic year. So despite that, there has been an increase in military expenditure. 9 countries still have 13,410 nuclear weapons in their arsenal, of which 2,000 are kept on high alert, ready to be used within minutes. The excessive accumulation and illicit trade of conventional weapons jeopardizes international peace and security and sustainable development, while the use of heavy conventional weapons in populated areas puts civilians at serious risk. New and emerging weapons technologies such as emerging technologies such as autonomous weapons pose a threat to global security and have received increased attention from the international community in recent years. The reality is that reduction of weapons of all kinds requires our full attention in order to achieve a lasting peace. We can't have peace with objects designed to destroy each other. And that's a given. So with the objective of promoting disarmament through action, information, awareness, and education to contribute to peace and security efforts and to achieve all the objectives of sustainable development, this webinar opens a dialogue and provides a framework for exchange with the with the disarmament community to deepen understanding on the subject. And just to, this is just to give you a little bit of a background on what we're gonna sort of talk about today. But I also want to go a little bit over the agenda. So what will happen is, of course, I'm going to introduce the speakers first, and once the speakers have gone, we will have a question and answer session. So if you do have questions from our speakers, then put them in the chat, and we will take a look at those and eventually also ask our speakers. It's a great opportunity to learn, so don't waste the opportunity, of course. And I encourage everyone to have at least one question. And I will also ask everyone to make sure your mic is muted. If you're not speaking, then make sure it's muted, and have your camera off if you're not, of course, part of the panel. And so these are just some simple rules. And I will also ask participants to put their email in the chat and which organizations they belong to. It will help us understand a little bit of the network that we have here. And these are just the simple rules. And without further ado, I will introduce the next speaker, our first speaker, Dr. Olamide Samuel. Dr. Samuel is an expert in arms control, nuclear policy, and international security. He is currently a research associate at SOAS, the University of London, as well as a research associate in nuclear politics at Leicester University. He has done multiple stakeholder engagement to facilitate negotiated settlements, has held lectures, has been part of different forums such as the United Nations, African Union, Harvard University, and he's also contributed to Al Jazeera, the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists, and France 24. So as you can see, it's quite impressive, and this someone who is well known in the field and also knows what he's talking about. So welcome, Dr. Samuel. You may go ahead.
Thank you so much, Media, for that very, very generous introduction. I must say it's definitely a pleasure to be here and to be engaging with CRIDS. And, you know, it's a particular honor for me to be sharing the same panel with Mr. Mark Fmct, who has been a longtime mentor of mine. And before what Nigerians would call the accolades started coming in, Mr. Fmct has been extremely influential in, you know, connecting me with the experts and with the expertise that I required to, you know, progress in this career. So, you know, it's just such an honor to be here. Now, I'd like to start off by admitting that, you know, prior to this panel discussion, I was torn between preparing a statement the same way, you know, they do at diplomatic forums, and just reading these facts out, and then, you know, having some peripheral space for interaction. But, you know, given what is going on in the world today, and given the massive political movements around COP26, I feel as though, you know, opening up the space for a much more interactive discussion might be the best way to go ahead. Because although we're referred to as experts in the field, what I've found in the past few weeks is that there are a lot of complex questions, part of which requires expertise in international security and disarmament, but many of which require expertise, you know, that is only found in the climate change movement, or expertise that's only found within the human rights circles or humanitarian law. And so having this particular conversational forum would be a way for me to learn from participants, as well as exchange, you know, information with you guys. So I'm going to keep my opening remarks brief, and then hopefully we'll have more space for interaction. So today, since we're focusing on promoting disarmament and non-proliferation as an imperative for international peace and security, I felt as though it would be important for us to clarify what we mean by disarmament. Partly because in recent times, at least outside the disarmament field, so more in the arms control and non-proliferation field, disarmament is usually portrayed as just the total elimination of a particular weapons class. And so there's a reductionism that's going on around how we define and conceptualize disarmament. So I want us to, first of all, have a baseline agreement of what we mean when we're talking about disarmament here, because it's much more comprehensive and much wider reaching than what the reductionist arguments propose. So I'm going to use a very simple definition from UNODA's Disarmament Education Dashboard, which is a fantastic resource for early career researchers. And so UNODA says that disarmament is a broad spectrum of unilateral, bilateral, multilateral, and regional measures and agreements that eliminate, regulate, or reduce armaments, armed forces, and military expenditures. So from this particular definition of disarmament, we see that elimination is only one part of disarmament affairs. The regulation is also another part that can be applied to both the numbers and intensity or complexity of weapons, but also regulating behavior and human behavior, armed forces, force postures, and regulating military expenditures. Now, when we understand disarmament this comprehensively, we can really begin to see how we link it to international security, but further to link it to development. And so, disarmament, broadly defined in this way, allows us to see that actually, when we think about organizations like the United Nations, if we go back to the very first General Assembly resolution from the UN, they called for the control of atomic energy to the extent necessary to ensure its use only for peaceful purposes, further requiring the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons. Now, although this resolution was very focused on nuclear energy and atomic technologies, the spirit of the law, the spirit of the resolution was really about regulating, eliminating a particular class of weapons or a particular type of technology, and at the same time, freeing up that particular technology for peaceful uses and for developmental purposes. So if we take away the nuclear element of this particular explanation, we can see that the UN understood from its very first General Assembly resolution that disarmament and development are intertwined. And the more we can have disarmament, the more resources can be freed up for development. And this particular tradition has been carried on forward throughout the years in the UN's history. The UN itself stylizes itself as an international security organization, broadly defined. And when we look at Article 11 of the UN Charter, Article 24 and Article 26, which we can get to in more detail in a moment, we really begin to see how, as an international security organization, the UN isn't focused on, just force posture or the movement of militaries or hard security. The UN is a collective security framework that provides security on the basis of dialogue, on the basis of negotiation, but also on the basis of the organization of different states' national interests. How can we coordinate these interests in a way that increases security, broadly defined, for the whole of humanity, and try to mitigate or manage those national security interests for particular states that might be negative for the whole of humanity. So the UN in itself is a security tool and an international security organization. Now, from this understanding, recognizing the more specialized agencies that were developed to control the spread of nuclear weapons and conventional weapons, we begin to see how agencies like the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, the UN Disarmament Commission, which has now become the Conference on Disarmament, and also the various treaty mechanisms that's been developed within the UN to control certain classes of weapons, such as the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. When we begin to see how all of these different treaty mechanisms and convention mechanisms, weave into the larger whole of the UN disarmament framework, which feeds into international security. However, given this treaty mechanisms, these specialized agencies, and these lofty goals that the UN, set for itself in its inception, we still see, and the fact remains, that we are overarmed and peace is underfunded. And what I mean by this is, in the registration form for this particular webinar, I loved that CRIDS, put the number of nuclear weapons front and center. They highlighted that we have about 13,500 nuclear weapons possessed by 9 states, many of which are just as powerful and much more powerful than those nuclear weapons that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We also have, moving away from nuclear weapons, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. It's a massive problem in many portions of the globe, including the United States. Now, when we look at places like sub-Saharan Africa, considering only quantitatively the proliferation of small arms and light weapons to the sub-region, Africa isn't really overarmed. There's about 50 million small arms and light weapons in Africa. The problem is, the behavioral aspects of the utilization and the ownership of these arms. So I mentioned America before. There are high rates of private ownership of small arms and light weapons. And we see that the incidence rate in terms of the use of these weapons for crime, in terms of the use of these weapons for terrorism, is relatively high for a developed country. If we look at Switzerland, which has per capita more weapons per person than the United States, we see that the incidence of armed violence is not even comparable to the United States, right? So the arms themselves are a problem, but the behaviors attached to them as well, the societal behaviors, the hypermasculinity, the militarization of society is also a huge problem. Now, coming back down to Africa, I said earlier that we had around 50 million small arms and light weapons. However, compared to the United States, the incidence of armed violence in Africa is remarkably high. And I think this has a lot to do with the ownership structures, wherein only about 11 million of these arms are wholly owned and utilized by states and state parastatals, whereas we have a remainder of about 41 million that are either owned by private individuals who have registered their arms, but the majority of that, and now I'm giving rough figures because these are from 2017, about 30 million of these arms are not necessarily registered and are not traceable to a particular owner. And it is crazy, that in today's day and age where we have big tech, we have artificial intelligence, we have all these ways of quantitatively and qualitatively solving data, tracking, the movement of data, we still don't have a reliable means of governing small arms and light weapons in Africa. And this brings me to how disarmament and the problems associated with the proliferation of weapons impedes development. Because recently I was given a lecture at UNHCR, and this was a special session wherein a lot of refugees that have interest in skilling up their resumes and learning different other areas of expertise coming together and have lectures and interact. And in my interaction with one of these students from sub-Saharan Africa, he highlighted the human side of the problem of small arms and light weapons proliferation. I've given the quantitative and some qualitative sides of it. But this person was from South Sudan, and he highlighted that although he hasn't focused and followed disarmament very closely, my quantitative exploration of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons really struck a chord with him, because cattle rustling, for example, is a huge problem in South Sudan, and he has been proxy to that violence in many ways. He has seen many of his family members and many people in society that he knows be killed because they owned cattle and because rustlers, who are basically cattle thieves, come in with small arms and light weapons and attack the owners of this cattle, that shoot the owners, threaten them and take away their cattle. And that South Sudanese government has been having quite a big problem, dealing with this issue. Now, in my response to him, I first gave some of the technical solutions to this: the marking, tracking and tracing of small arms and light weapons, and of course, amnesty programs that could help to reduce and remove small arms and light weapons from the social political system. But his response to me was actually much more valuable than my physical stockpile security management response, which was that he was able to connect that stockpile security management response to a whole other host of issues, such as climate change, which is driving cattle rustlers down south, and also driving cattle herders down south. The lack of institutions in South Sudan, which actually sort of created part of the proliferation problem. The lack of institutions such as a police force or judiciary that can adjudicate disputes between individuals and communities. And, by the time we put these different drivers of conflict together and also highlighted the arms control issue in South Sudan, we were able to at least begin to identify the problem a little bit better and a lot more comprehensively. And this is how I think disarmament and our studies here can really support the development agenda, because we bring a different toolkit and problem analysis and problem solving toolkit to the table. Now, I'm not entirely sure if I've run over time, but there's still quite a lot of things that I would like to talk about. However, I would love to hand over back to Media so we can also hear from Mr. Mark Finod, and then we can have a question and answer section. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ola, and that was wonderful. Thank you for teaching us on that, because certainly there are interesting questions that are coming up in my head, and which I would love to ask you a little later. But in the meantime, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Monsieur Marc Finot. Monsieur Finot is a former French diplomat who now works for the Geneva Center for Security Policy, where he trains diplomats and military officers in international and human security and conducts research in those fields. He is also the vice president at IDN Initiatives pour le Disarmament Nucléaire and a prominent figure of CRIDS. During his 36-year career as a diplomat, he served in several bilateral postings in the Soviet Union, in Poland, Israel, Australia, and as well as multilateral missions. And he is very, very well known in his field. And I'm proud to introduce Monsieur Marc Finot. You may go ahead.
Thank you very much, Media, for the kind introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you for this initiative, for this invitation. And I'm really glad to have the chance to sit on the same panel with Ola. And actually, I will just follow up on his statement, because he rightly pointed to the conceptual approach of this question, disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control. Sometimes in the general public, in the media, it's not very clear what's the difference between these concepts. Now, as he's rightly pointed out, disarmament includes or implies prohibition of weapons and their elimination. Non-proliferation is a preventative approach to prevent the spread of weapons to new states, but also it became this is horizontal non-proliferation. But then there was a concept of vertical proliferation, the buildup of weapons by the same state. And arms control is, I would say, the lightest form of all these responses to arms proliferation, because it only means regulation, just making sure that there's not too much advantage for one partner or adversary. And this is a form of actually managing the arms race. And this is what we see, what we have witnessed over the years between the United States and the Soviet Union and then Russia. So sometimes, this confusion is instrumentalized or is maintained on purpose. First, it's clear that when you look at each international treaty dealing with these issues, you will realize that very often they overlap. I mean, in the sense that they have some component of disarmament, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is, of course, a key article on nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament. But then, of course, the non-proliferation dimension. If you take the Chemical Weapons Convention, it has actually the three components: disarmament, prohibition, elimination, non-proliferation, no transfer of the weapons or control over the precursors that would help make chemical weapons, and of course no development, no testing, etc., which of course are considered as part of arms control. So it's good always to have this in mind, to keep this in mind when we look at the various instruments. And when we take this whole set of measures, of responses to arms proliferation, you realize that they are not an end in themselves. The end is actually to increase, to achieve international security. So, of course, during the Cold War, there was focus on national security, state security, and after the Cold War, more focus on human security, protection of civilians in conflict, and basically dealing with the interrelationship with all the existential threats, such as Ola mentioned, climate change, or now as we can see, pandemics. Now I think this is a good initiative when we start thinking about all these responses. If you take the example of nuclear weapons, of course, for many, they are considered as indispensable tools for achieving national security, but for the majority of countries in the world, they are threats to international security or even the survival of humanity. So it's interesting now when we look at one of the responses to these security threats by the majority of states, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Let's look at the arguments pro and con, because actually this is a good opportunity to precisely address this conundrum and these differences between the various approaches. The opponents of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons tell us it's a wrong approach. Prohibition, elimination will come only at the end. We have to start preparing, by a step-by-step approach. And which steps are they mentioning? Of course, reduction of arsenals, the largest arsenals of the United States and Russia, which makes sense. It's an indispensable step. But then they mention entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Well, Test Ban Treaty has been open for signature since 1996, but it still lacks ratification of 8 states, including 6 nuclear armed states. So they have a certain responsibility in the fact that this treaty is still not in force. Then they say, yes, we also need a treaty to prohibit the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons. Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, Fmct. Again, it's been on the agenda of the Conference on Disarmament for many years, but there is no agreement to even start the negotiation of this treaty because of the various approaches. The nuclear armed states say, yes, we're ready to stop producing more fissile material, just turn off the tap. But the pool is already full. With the existing stockpiles in the world, you could manufacture actually 10 times more nuclear weapons than the 13,000 still existing. So that's why the majority of states say, okay, let's agree to stop production, but let's do something about the existing stockpiles. Let's also work on how to eliminate these stockpiles. Then the nuclear weapon states say, oh yes, disarmament, yeah, it's a distant goal, but now we cannot, move faster because of the international security context. We need the proper environment, the proper conditions to allow disarmament. And they say, for instance, the first step, the more urgent step, or the priority should be on non-proliferation, because look at these bad guys, North Korea, Iran, they are very dangerous, and so we should, focus on on this proliferation. But the majority of states who have accepted the constraints of non-proliferation in the Non-Proliferation Treaty didn't make those conditional. They accepted all the constraints, even the verification by the IAEA, the additional protocol, which is additional constraint, the time frame, etc. But the nuclear weapon states say, yeah, we need the conditions, and those should not be preconditions. Then they accuse the supporters of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons of undermining the NPT. It's against the NPT. We shouldn't actually touch the NPT. It's the cornerstone of the whole architecture. But look at the NPT. Even just reading the text, you realize how obsolete, how outdated it is. There's a whole article, Article 5, on peaceful nuclear explosions, which is completely outdated because it's been overtaken by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which prohibits any kind of nuclear explosion. Article 6 of the NPT doesn't mention prohibition of testing. It's mentioned in the preamble, but it's not specific in Article 6. So it was adopted beyond the requirements of the NPT, or as a step forward after the NPT. The same as the additional protocol, which I mentioned. It is an additional step compared to the obligation of full scope safeguards, which is derived from the NPT. So that means that the treaty should not be considered as, cast in stone, untouchable. It was a part of history, and now this is not a reason why history shouldn't move forward. There's another argument which I think is very bad faith by the nuclear power states, is that they accuse the civil society groups that support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons of undermining democracy, giving favorable status for authoritarian regimes or dictatorships, weakening actually democratic regimes, because this is true that civil society can express itself, can exert pressures, can take initiatives in open societies. But at the same time, the same countries, the same governments that claim to be democratic, they just refuse to see the majority views in their own society, which are, undoubtedly in favor of nuclear disarmament, as testified by regular polls. So where's the democracy here? Then the the opponents to the treaty say, oh, but it's useless. It will have no effect because it's been rejected by the nuclear powers. Well, again, if you look at the text of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, even if there are states that reject it, don't sign, don't ratify, they are not parties, they're not bound by the obligations of the treaty, but the states parties to the treaty, when they start applying their commitments, implementing their obligations, this may have an indirect effect even on non-state parties. For instance, the provisions on non-assistance to the production of nuclear weapons, even countries which are party to the TPNW, which have universities, labs, companies or banks that fund the production of nuclear weapons by other countries, this will become illegal. And so that may affect indirectly the nuclear armed states. This is actually happening in the case of landmines, when the US refused to sign the anti-personnel landmine treaty ban, but at the same time, and they mentioned, of course, the case of South Korea, but at the same time, they stopped producing landmines until Trump resumed that. And they are the first donor of assistance to mine clearance. So that, again, indirect effects on non-states parties. Then they claim, TPNW is unilateral disarmament. It's forced upon us. Well, again, that's not very good faith, because TPNW is a multilateral treaty, and the provisions that would apply if nuclear armed states join that treaty would be very flexible. They would give those states the choice of either disarming and joining, or joining and presenting a program of disarmament, which will be approved by all the other states parties. But that would leave them, all the flexibility in terms of timing and modalities. Would that be unilateral, bilateral, multilateral? Again, the treaty gives them all the necessary flexibility. And by the way, there have been cases, many precedents of agreed decisions to disarm unilaterally, especially the 1991 nuclear presidential initiatives between the US and Russia. And what has a country like France done, and even claim of doing, is unilateral disarmament. France reduced by half its arsenal without consulting anyone. It just announced that it did it. And so at the same time, France now criticizes TPNW as unilateral disarmament. Then, of course, we can come back to the whole discourse about nuclear deterrence, strategic stability that leads to peace. Of course, we, as Ola mentioned, armed conflict has not disappeared because there are nuclear weapons, including among nuclear armed states. And therefore, it's impossible to prove, the proof of the absence is impossible. You cannot have evidence that it's because countries were afraid of nuclear weapons that they didn't start World War III. And actually, if you look at the doctrines of nuclear weapon states themselves, they include the scenario, the possibility of failure of deterrence in their own doctrines. Well, first, having anti-missile defense is a way of recognizing that you expect that your nuclear weapons don't terrorize enough the adversary, and that they may launch missiles against you. So that's why you erect this form of defense. For instance, in the French doctrine, you have this scenario of ultimate warning, last warning, which is actually launching a nuclear weapon on a military target in case the deterrence has failed. You know, it's part of the official doctrine. So again, there's no trust even in this doctrine by the nuclear powers themselves. And the result is that has been recognized by many experts, many leaders. The risk of nuclear war is now higher than during the Cold War, because of course there are more actors, and these doctrines include first strike, and the categories of weapons which are deployed are more usable, usable in war fighting. And then the nuclear weapon states also say, yes, but you know, we won't disarm now because you know, there is proliferation, buildup of conventional arms. Okay, but who are the largest producers and exporters of conventional arms? You know, the same that have the nuclear weapons. So they have this responsibility. And they claim also that they are in compliance with the NPT. Article 6, yes, it's fine. Look at the number of nuclear weapons that we reduced since the Cold War. Of course, it's true, 80% reduction. But you know, it's work in progress. There's still 13,000 still around. And again, read the text of the treaty. Article 6 includes also obligation to negotiate in good faith measures for the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date. Entered into force in 1970, you know, more than 50 years ago, half a century ago. This was supposed to end at an early date, and now it's flourishing. You know, the nuclear arms race is really booming. And then, of course, you may ask the same question about peace and disarmament, this relationship. What comes first? Is it disarmament first or peace first? We have this dilemma, or this conundrum has been on the agenda, in particular for the Middle East, now since 1974, when the first proposal of a nuclear weapon-free zone was launched by Iran, and then expanded to all weapons of mass destruction. And, you know, again, this is not solvable. It's true that disarmament can help, can stabilize situations, can reduce the risk of armed conflict, and reduce the impact of conflict on people, on civilians. But it's not enough. You need some form of negotiation, some form of dialogue, or mutual recognition. So, you know, the tracks should be parallel. I will just conclude by mentioning another concept, which is also enshrined in the NPT, but which was sort of, you know, swept under the carpet for decades. It's the concept of general and complete disarmament. Now, when you hear this, you may say, oh my God, it's completely unrealistic, utopian. You know. But who invented this concept? It was the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They even proposed treaties on this, you know, sort of gradual program of disarmament, which would have focused, of course, on the most destabilizing categories of armament. And of course, it doesn't mean that you just eliminate every single weapon of the face of the earth. That's, of course, unrealistic. It means that you lower the levels of arsenals to the level of legitimate security interests. And of course, that you can allocate the necessary resources, enough resources to the needs of development. Again, this is enshrined in the UN Charter. This is enshrined in the NPT. So now it's time to revert, to sort of resurrect this concept. Of course, you know, it may not be easy to put together a treaty on general and complete disarmament, as required by the NPT, but some have done so. And civil society, SOAS, has been instrumental in putting forward a draft treaty, which is now being discussed by experts, by governments, and hopefully at the next review conference of the NPT in January in New York, it will be raised again, because it's really a good time to revive this approach of a comprehensive program or comprehensive approach of disarmament to increase security and peace. So thank you for your attention, and sorry if I've spoke too long.
Thank you, Monsieur Finot. That was actually quite well done, and it wasn't very long at all. It was actually really interesting to hear what you have to say, as always. And again, I always have questions in my head as I hear you talk, Porto, and I heard Ola before. But more than my questions, I know the audience has a lot of questions. So if anyone has more questions than the ones that I'm seeing right now, please do write them, or you can also raise your hand. I'll be happy to read those for you, or you can ask them yourself. So the first question I have here is from Jorge Lopez. He's saying that during the Cold War, civil society appeared to be more active and aware of the threat posed by nuclear weapons than it is today. Even though nuclear weapons represent an existential threat as much as climate change, why the latter receives more public attention than nuclear weapons today? Is this lack of public understanding awareness contributing to a nuclear disarmament impasse? And I'll put this question for both Ola and Monsieur Finot. Dr. Samuel and Monsieur Finot. Yes.
First of all, Ola is absolutely fine. I prefer that. I'll just jump in and go first. So Jorge, I think there's two answers to this particular question. The first is, I think there was a qualitative difference in the ways in which both great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, approached public discussions of nuclear weapons. In many ways, public discussion of nuclear weapons from both superpowers were very alarmist, and were actually messaging was framed in a way to escalate perceptions of potential nuclear use. So the Soviets was, I mean, a contemporary version of that would be Trump's tweet about having a big red button to rain fire and brimstone or whatever on North Korea. That escalatory communication by both superpowers as a way of, counterintuitively and I would rather say stupidly, ensuring that their deterrence was credible, actually had a slight democratic function in the sense that civil society were well aware of just how close to the brink both superpowers were. Now, as a result of this awareness of the risk, civil society was much better placed to galvanize public opinion, to say, look at what this president said, look at what the premier said as well. This is what they're saying in the official statements. We have to do something now, and we have to do it today. And so civil society was able to leverage the escalatory language of these superpowers. And then, from utilizing this escalatory language, they were able to break it down to what it actually means for regular people on the ground. What it means for people's homes, for their livelihoods, and they were able to communicate this much better. Now, I think today's civil society is not any less sophisticated, determined, or informed. What I think has happened is that great powers and nuclear weapon states have sort of de-democratized that debate. They found ways of couching their escalatory language in piles and piles of text, removing this from public discussion because they've seen the repercussion of escalatory language publicly. And so there's this huge air of secrecy which existed during the Cold War, but has been amplified today to such an extent that any meaningful engagement with the insanity of deterrence policies means that you have to read tons and tons of text, because if you point out the simple fallacy of the logic of deterrence, what the military wonks do is that they say, well, you must have missed this part because you didn't read so-and-so book from 1978 or so-and-so book from 1987. You're ill-informed. And so you can't talk about deterrence because you don't know enough. And so they've really removed this from the debate. But civil society has been very innovative these days in actually doing that back work and getting to the depth of whatever deterrence logic exists and try to translate how that is wrong to the general public. It's just become so much harder because many nuclear weapon states, and because non-nuclear weapon states don't possess the technologies, many nuclear weapon states, because non-nuclear weapon states don't possess nuclear weapons themselves, not just the technologies. Nuclear weapon states try to hold on to this logic. No, we have the weapons, so we really know what we're talking about. There's no space in this debate for those that don't have the weapons. They try to hold on to credibility. Okay, now civil society is still doing an excellent job, but I think that lack of public escalatory language that existed in the Cold War is, has removed the nuclear anxiety that existed in general debate at the time. Today we hear about climate anxiety because it's the center of debate and is very publicly spoken about. And that I think is the key difference, not in the quality of advocacy. And so in many ways, I would encourage civil society to continue to do the same thing that they're doing, just much more intensively, which is translating the messaging of the insanity of deterrence and the amount of risk that we face today to the general public. And one way to better optimize how civil society has been messaging general publics has a lot to do with engaging beyond Western audiences in many, many ways. In order to appear credible in the nuclear debate, I see a lot of civil society messaging falling into what we call nuke speak, the multiple acronyms and all the concepts and all the securitized languages. But what we really do need is diversity in civil society, because, for example, from the global south, many countries in Africa, we speak about the impact of nuclear weapons and the nuclear exchange, not necessarily from the point of view of nuclear risk or risk reduction. We speak about it from the point of view of global famine, from the point of view of blast heat and fire, the acceleration of climate change, and these are things that, these are messages that can only come about with diverse input, because every different person, every different, sub-region has a list of threats, existential threats, and a prioritization scheme for those that they deal with. And so if they're involved in civil society messaging, they'll find a way to translate what nuclear risk means to their local publics using threats that their local publics are already well aware of. So I'll pause there for now, and I'll hand over to Mr. Fina.
No, I agree, of course, with Ola. I think that the main difference is that, civil society or NGOs, tend to mobilize more easily when something is visible, or something is happening. You have an incident, or like during the early 60s, the American mothers realized that the milk they were feeding their babies was radioactive because of the nuclear testing in Nevada. So they launched this campaign that led to the adoption of the partial test ban treaty. Then you had big demonstrations, of course, during the Cold War against deployment of new missiles in Europe that led to the INF treaty. Now, of course, there's been a lot of effort, as Ola said, by governments of nuclear weapon states to either hide the situation or sort of anesthetize society, just by having some reassuring language on, of course, we rely on deterrence that will prevent war. As you can see, it has succeeded. So why should we stop? And this, of course, had the consequence of demobilizing societies, including, I know in France that even in parliament, it's very difficult to find any member of parliament who's even, basically informed, if not interested in the topic. So they are just resigned. They say, it's very technical, so we just trust the government to deal with that. Now, of course, you have seen a new era, a new generation of civil society organizations that have actually initiated all the treaties that were adopted since the end of the Cold War: Anti-Personnel Landmine Treaty, Cluster Munitions, Arms Trade Treaty, and now the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So they do play a role, but perhaps it's less visible. It's not, maybe not, 1 million people in Central Park. It's just advocacy, lobbying, convincing governments to adopt, to follow suit.
Thank you, Mr. Finot. These are really great responses, and we also have a thank you from the audience for both of your responses. Really appreciate that. I do want to ask a question that I actually had to both of you. So, Ola, you mentioned earlier that the United Nations is a collective forum for international security, and it's a great way to bring everyone together for global disarmament or global security issues. But how often is the narrative dominated by the global north, and what can we or we do, or also countries from the global south can do to change a little bit of the narrative and focus a little bit how much the weapons do affect the global south more than the global north? So this is for both of you guys.
Ola?
Thank you, Mr. Pinot, for letting me go first. I think that's a fascinating question. First of all, although the UN is an international security organization meant to foster collaborative approaches to collective security, we also have some exceptions within the structure of the United Nations that actually impedes this vision of collaborative security. So in the first instance, the sub-body of the United Nations that actually has the mandate to take action, including kinetic action, to ensure peace and security is actually the United Nations Security Council. And this council is dominated by Western states and also, China. And in many ways, the UN Security Council, to me, represents what we call a centripetal sort of post-conflict arrangement, wherein the winners of a major conflict, say in a particular state, get to decide how governance occurs for most of the subsequency of that conflict, because it's their interests that are represented at the founding of a particular system of representation. And so we have the UN Security Council with sweeping powers to authorize inspections, to enforce, kinetically even, particular resolutions, and to bypass the democratic body of the General Assembly. And I think that this in itself is very undemocratic, and there needs to be structural reform of the UN Security Council to, at the very least, make it much more representative of the human demographics we have today. The second most populous country in the world is not on the UN Security Council, India, right? It's still a nuclear weapon state, right? The most populous countries in Africa are not represented as well. What we're expected to be fine with is rotating 2-year invitations to come and play UN Security Council roles, but without that veto power. There are some benefits to being a temporary member of the UN Security Council, don't get me wrong, but they're nowhere near the benefits of continuance, the benefits of stability, and the benefits of a veto, right? And this is why the UN Security Council pretty much still represents a sort of global post-colonial order, or a global imperial order in many ways. Now, what can global South countries do? As Mark Finot highlighted, from a civil society perspective, the leading role that civil society has played in the introduction of numerous treaties. One thing you would identify from the treaties that he highlighted is that many of these were discussed in the first committee of the UN General Assembly. And in the case of the TPNW, as a matter of fact, the introductory discussions around the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons use were taken away from the United Nations completely. We had the humanitarian conferences in Oslo, in Nayarit, in Mexico. They had 3 of them. And that is where consensus was formed about the devastating humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons before it was then returned to the UN General Assembly. So we saw a bypassing of the mechanisms of restriction within the UN by states because they had the agency, innovation, and determination to get a particular thing done. The negotiation of the TPNW was by no means an easy task whatsoever. There were so many divisions regarding, for example, environmental remediation and who should be in charge of this. There were many obstacles, right? But the fact is, with all of these obstacles, which can stymie any treaty, even within the UN General Assembly process, these states outside the General Assembly process were still able to reach a negotiated settlement, and we have a nuclear ban treaty today. So with determination, with agency, global South states can still introduce democratic processes or force democracy on top of the UN system to get things done. And I think that this is a trend that is very, very likely to continue. The TPNW is still ignored by nuclear weapon states and by most nuclear weapons umbrella states. And very recently we've been seeing how Norway has been highlighted as some sort of global champion because they want to observe the TPNW. I'm not bashing that particular campaign, but I think that messaging around the TPNW still needs to recognize the importance of global South leadership and involvement, and not dismiss that centrality of global South states by putting global North states that are doing the bare minimum, observing the treaty, on a pedestal. It sends the wrong message to global South states that have fought really hard to get this treaty into force. So I'll pause there for now, and I'll hand over to Mr. Finot.
Yes, and actually, there's been always this sort of confrontation, but also coexistence between what Gramsci called the old world that is dying and the new world that is being born, but which, of course, causes a lot of pain. And as Ola said, there's a trend. The symbols of the old world, of course, are the Security Council and the NPT, with this discrimination between nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states. And this is why all the events and initiatives that took place in recent years precisely tend to bypass these blockages, these vetoes. Of course, the TPNW is one example, but look at even the Chemical Weapons Convention. Again, I remember the negotiation was also very difficult because the superpowers or the big powers tried to retain some form of control or advantage, but this was not accepted. And more recently, you had the case of the division between Russia and the other members of the Security Council, because Russia vetoed all the resolutions that criticized Syria for its use of chemical weapons. And the only way to solve that problem was to rely on the mechanism of the convention, that doesn't give Russia a right of veto. You know, there's a majority vote, and the Executive Council adopted this change in the system of inspection that Russia tried to veto. So again, there are of course now ways where multilateralism can help bring about these collective solutions. And this can happen also on a regional basis. You know, look at the achievements of the 5 nuclear weapon-free zones. That makes almost the whole southern hemisphere nuclear weapon-free. And again, this was decided by the states of the global south themselves on their own.
Okay, thank you very much for the responses. Sorry, I'm Wendy, the other moderator. I was late from work, so thanks, Media, for taking over. And without further ado, because we're almost running out of time, there is the last question from Munoz. He says that in terms of working together, public, private, people sectors, to advance peace, disarmament, and non-proliferation in all realms, would you have insights or actionable recommendations for enhancing collaborative governance? Because it seems we are in a great need of inclusive collaboration, trust, and meaningful international cooperation to tackle humanity's current and future existential challenges. So yeah, I'll just pose the question to both of you.
Ola?
Yes, thank you very much, Wendy, for asking that question. And we fully understand that you weren't able to be here in time. I must highlight for the record that, the entirety of CRIDS staff are volunteers who have full-time jobs and are doing this as a labor of love, and that is remarkable. So thank you for being able to make it and for facilitating the run-up to this webinar. So with regards to collaborative governance, first of all, if this isn't a concept that's already been very clearly defined elsewhere, I'll take a stab at it by saying that, or by assuming that collaborative governance, of course, means the combination of civil society, people, states, and institutions working together to tackle humanity's shared problems. Now, if that interpretation is wrong or incomplete, when asked, please feel free to ask the question, give us some clarification by turning on your video and speaking, but I'll carry on. Now, with regards to collaborative governance, I think it is increasingly the norm in many ways. We're not really seeing it as clearly yet, but I think if we look at the past decade in review, collaborative governance is becoming the norm, not because of preference of states. States are still very much national interest centric, but because of the necessity of global challenges, most recent of which was the COVID pandemic. It really tested the extent to which states and institutions could engage in multilateral cooperation to face a common challenge. And unfortunately, in many ways, I believe that collaborative governance and multilateral cooperation showed to be non-existent in a lot of our states' psyches. States still remain extremely self-interested, extremely national interest centric, protecting, their own domestic populations, and even within the domestic populations, protecting privileged subsections of these populations. We see vaccine apartheid as a term that is something that's very recognizable. Where in the global north, we're talking about booster jabs, whereas a massive swath of the global south still are lacking access to not only vaccines, but there's been countries in North Africa that are still talking about ventilators and PPE. And there's companies and organizations in the global north that are still holding on to patents and do not want to democratize or share. So I think we have a long way to go, at least with regards to multilateral cooperation. And I think that inclusive collaboration or collaborative governance, from what I see, might be a way to go, because if we have people and if we have private interests that are representing a much larger swath of community to government and to those decision makers, then at least we have increased pressure on these decision makers to take steps in the direction of those interests that are represented. You know, having people at the table, having diverse people at the table is the first step in making sure that at least there's some sort of representation that would not have occurred if those people are not at the table. You know, and I think moving on from there, we hope that this representation gets more and more effective. Just in closing, you know, take the example of the TPNW. Again, arms control and disarmament is a hyper-masculine space in many ways, historically, culturally. You know, when we talk about security, we keep talking about the militarized version of security. And many states have you know, utilized the gender disparity in terms of the drafting policies that they have in their militaries, which means that you find militaries made up of men, perhaps some of the most masculine men, with a very narrow definition of security. And they progress through ranks and become policymakers and reflect the cultures and values that help them to succeed within the military complex on their way to the top. And so in many situations and instances where state confrontation was likely, instead of choosing collaboration or dialogue, or even choosing patience to better understand the problem, the first response, the culturally you know, attuned response, has been conflict, you know, aggression. With the TPNW, at the beginning of the humanitarian initiative, what we started hearing, you know, was a completely different interpretation of how to look at nuclear conflict. We were no longer talking about limited nuclear war or targeting priorities or alerting status or early warning systems. We were now talking about blast, radiation, fire, long-term effects on reproductive health, effects on societies, effects on emergency response. And we, you know, this is something that should have been obvious to nuclear weapons developers and to nuclear weapons analysts. But because there was a lack of representation of women at the table, who more culturally have been confined in many societies to the other side of society, society's scaffolding, which is taking care of families and, you know, carrying out menial tasks within the home. They've been forced there. It wasn't necessarily a choice. At least from that understanding, they started highlighting, this is how nuclear weapons will look from the point of view of, you know, my sisters or my cousins who are at home. This is what they've been saying about the impact of nuclear tests on reproductive health. They weren't looking at nuclear tests as a scientific exercise that helps them to better modify or miniaturize warheads. They were looking at it from the point of view of, you know, the poisoning of water tables, the poisoning of lives, and the poisoning of livelihoods. And so I think in many ways, just by having adequate representation of diverse sectors of society, we can really begin to re-problematize issues and come up with much more comprehensive solutions. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Yes, of course, I agree. And you know, it's true that in this field of disarmament, non-proliferation, disarmament, it's sometimes difficult to imagine how this collaboration could work. But we have good examples. You know, in the field of the biological weapons, for instance, you know, there is this framework of the Biological Weapons Convention. There was an attempt for a few years to negotiate a verification protocol because the convention doesn't have verification provisions. And this was rejected by the United States in 2001. So as a substitute, it was decided to have regular meetings with experts, with representatives of civil society and the biotech industry to work with government on finding solutions to address this risk of use of intentional or accidental use of disease as a weapon or as a form of terrorism. And this has been fairly successful because you can do more, and it's encouraged. NGOs are encouraged to take part in these regular meetings. But anyway, we have a good example. The TPNW was also a good example because not only civil society initiated the treaty, but it actually took part in the negotiation. This was made possible thanks to this UN framework. Unfortunately, at the Conference on Disarmament, it's very difficult because access by NGOs is almost impossible. And then the private sector also should be more integrated. Sometimes, we hear about a group of governmental experts on cyber security, cyber warfare, but who's actually behind the technology? It's the private sector. So they should be part of this global effort to reduce the risk of cyber attacks, to improve protection and prevent or prohibit attacks that may hurt civilians. So again, there are a number of avenues that could be pursued to increase this form of collaboration.
Okay, thank you so much. I know I had said that we are reaching the end of this segment, but then I have more incoming questions. So basically, you're both prominent figures within CRIDS, and we're very, very proud of that, by the way. The focal points of CRIDS are information, awareness, and education. What role can CRIDS play in promoting disarmament and non-proliferation, and how? Yeah, so Ola, you can.
I was going to say, for the record, that perhaps it might be excellent if we had perhaps the director of CRIDS or the coordinator to highlight what role CRIDS can play or what they have been playing, because they've been playing an extremely important role. But by way of prescription, I would say that CRIDS can really utilize its fascinating platforms that it's developed very effectively and very speedily over the past 2 years, channels of communication, to really help to translate, or using Ming Sin's words, to vulgarize some of these treaties and agreements and processes and understandings in ways that grassroots organizations can really learn from, connect to, and implement. And I think that CRIDS is already doing a fantastic job there, and we just need more of the same. A very practical suggestion, not even a suggestion, on a very practical note, CRIDS is very unique precisely because it targets a larger swath of sub-Saharan Africa, because due to its multilingual makeup, we see that CRIDS can have webinars and activities in French, in English, and this is something that's really breaking down barriers that I've seen raised up in sub-Saharan Africa with regards to language. This is one organization that's able to seamlessly move through different sub-Saharan African countries and connect to different audiences there. So I really do applaud that as well. Perhaps I would hand over to Mark or any of the coordinators of CRIDS to have a word.
Of course, I've supported CRIDS from the beginning, and I really commend them for their activities and spreading, as you said, all our good knowledge, good information. So that's a very important task. I think that one way of also maybe promoting disarmament and arms control is also to give each individual or each NGO a toolbox, and that they could use for their own activities, for their own advocacy, because every one of us could, just send a letter to a member of parliament or write an op-ed in a newspaper or on a website. And, you know, even if we feel that this is just a drop in the ocean, in the end, you know, it can build up. It can raise awareness in society, including among decision makers. So don't underestimate the power that civil society can have, and NGOs like CRIDS can certainly help them.
Thank you. I don't know if our directors want to comment on that as well. Mingson and Sims. Mingson, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, my name is Mingson Mingina. I am the coordinator at CRID, which is the Center for Research and Information for Disarmament and Security. And yes, our focal points are education, awareness raising, and education. Sorry, and yes, I say information first, awareness raising and education. Yes, yeah, I think what Ola said and Mark said, I think they're both pivotal for us, and we believe that with the required or necessary tools, we can achieve our vision, which is, as I said before, educate people. And we're trying to play a major role in terms of promoting disarmament and non-proliferation and in Africa, especially in Africa. And we believe that, I know not everyone in CRID is from Africa, but we believe that in Africa we have lots of many armed conflicts, and we believe that we can play a major role over there. So thank you very much again, Mark Finot and Ola, for your support, and we believe that together we can play, as I say, a big role in terms of promoting disarmament in the world and specifically in Africa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mingson. Another question is, why is the implementation of the United Nations Secretary General's New Disarmament Agenda 2018 important and becoming a necessity for international peace and security?
I don't know if my chat function is frozen because I can't see these questions.
Ah, sorry, they're coming through messages. My personal chats. That's why.
Okay, because I usually like to read them out at the same time.
Okay, I can reread it again if I was reading very fast. Can yes, I? Please. Okay. So the question is, why is the implementation of the United Nations Secretary General's New Disarmament Agenda 2018 important and becoming a necessity for international peace and security?
All right, I'll take a stab at that first and hand over to Mr. Finot. So I think the Secretary General's Disarmament Agenda is really a game changer. A lot of people don't really recognize how important it is that there was such a sustained political push behind disarmament as one of the mandates of the Secretary General. And so, securing our common future, as he named the agenda, is extremely important because it takes into account 4 pillars that we need to consider to secure our common future. He starts off with a disarmament to save humanity. Secondly, disarmament that saves lives. Thirdly, disarmament for future generations. And fourth, strengthening partnerships for disarmament. And I think each of these pillars are important to consider when we're thinking about implementation of disarmament, because when we think about disarmament to save humanity, that is where our focus becomes, or our focus shifts to planetary issues, to issues like climate change or thermonuclear war, those things that can be facilitated by strategic conflict between great powers. And so one aspect of disarmament to save humanity, focused on these WMDs and on these huge strategic conflicts that are possible, enables us to articulate disarmament strategies within this theater, separately from disarmament that saves lives, which looks a lot more at the humanitarian impact of conventional arms, small arms and light weapons, and excessive accumulation and illicit trade of conventional arms. This really allows us to apply a slightly more different toolkit, to different theaters, mostly in the global south, where the humanitarian impact of the illicit trafficking of arms and ammunition is the WMD there. When we talk about Africa, we say our real WMD are small arms and light weapons. And so I think articulating this disarmament in a way that saves lives really gives us a space to further conceptualize how to deal with the small arms and light weapons issue. And I did see a question in the chat box that was talking about the Arms Trade Treaty, and another question that was talking about the illicit transfer of arms and ammunition. This is precisely the sort of sub-element of the Securing Our Common Future framework, where these particular conversations can be had. I'm not going to digress into those two questions yet, but I was just highlighting them as part of this framework. Disarmament for future generations, I think, is one of the most important aspects of this Securing Our Common Future framework, because when we think about disarmament, we think about remediative efforts for things that have already happened. We think about controlling, eliminating, governing weapons today. But for our future generations, when we have this lens of analysis on, what we begin to see is that things like nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons use cannot be confined to one country or two countries when it is utilized. When we think about future generations, then we'll start to think about the time element of it as well. Because most of the weapons we've had up until date are weapons that cause harm in the now. Whereas nuclear weapons are not only damaging for now, but they're damaging for future generations. And so it completely changes how we see the use of weapons and the importance of disarmament in this context, because some weapons cannot be contained both in space and in time. And finally, and this goes back to Minaz's question, was strengthening partnerships for disarmament, identifying ways in which we can bolster national, regional, and international partnerships that can better connect areas of expertise, areas of advocacy, areas of science and technology to help secure our common future in general. So I really think the articulation of this framework by the Secretary General was extremely important to help coordinate diversified action on the issue. And I'll pause there for now. Thanks.
Yes, very true. And I think the main reason why it's important is precisely because it is based on a holistic approach to security, which actually relates all the risks, the threats deriving from armament or over-armament with all the other elements which are within the mandate of the UN, like dealing with conflict, development, any form of existential threats. So in itself, that's enough to grant its value and its importance to this report, which of course was the result of very serious work by all the UN departments, including UNODA, UNIDIR. But the main conclusion, of course, is that the UN itself is powerless if it can't rely on the goodwill and the political will of the member states. So, as you can expect, the reaction of nuclear weapon states was not very positive to the report, especially in the part dealing with nuclear disarmament. But this doesn't stop them and any other state from expressing interest in supporting at least some parts of the report. And the report, you can check, there is a specific website, and a number of states have offered their support to act as champion state of one or the other issue, like gender or small arms or chemicals, chemical proliferation, etc. So you can see the list of these countries, and you can see what they have done to support, to to materialize, to make their support operational and concrete. So that's a good approach. But of course, it has to be reminded on a regular basis. And so it's like you know, flag to keep agitating. It's not just a report to shelf, to forget about, but to keep as a sort of roadmap to promote you know, disarmament and security.
Okay, thank you so much. But allow me to also apologize for going over time. I know that we are all busy, but then yes, thank you very much for the very insightful presentations and for taking the time off your busy schedules again and teaching us. I've learned a lot, and I hope that we all learned something. So this concludes our webinar. And to our participants, thank you very much for your patience, for watching and participating, coming up with all those brilliant questions. And yeah, until next time. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.